Good day. Welcome to the Cory Morgan Show. What a crazy news year it's going to be wrapping up to be. We got elections going on either side of Alberta. We got elections south of the border. War breaking out in the Middle East. Well, what else is new over there? But endless subjects for political weenies like me to cover and share with you. So thanks for joining in to share those with me today. Use that comment scroll. I see a few of you checking in. Those of you who are watching live, Jessica out in Ontario, Colleen, Jordan. I appreciate seeing that there's actually people out there watching. I'm not just talking to myself like I do when I'm driving in the car alone. And send me questions, comments, ideas. It helps keep the show lively and just keep things civil. So I'm going to have Dr. Frances Widdowson on a little later. She's going to talk about reconciliation, those sorts of issues. She, of course, had been fired by the Mount Royal University for daring to question the orthodoxy on indigenous affairs in Canada. So it should be a good conversation. It ties into what my opening rant, I guess you say, is about. So good to see you there, Mr. Stanley, and the Saxon fella and Paradoxy. Lots of folks checking in. So let's talk. Yeah, we had Truth and Reconciliation Day, the other one. Canada observed its fourth one, and the truth was often actually nowhere to be found. In fact, myths and fabrications were just more deeply entrenched as Indigenous people were invited and encouraged to share tales of historical abuse while never being challenged on the veracity of their claims. Now, the granddaddy of all those myths is, of course, the false claim of 215 children having died of abuse being buried at the Kamloops residential school. Now, that hoax endures despite years of passing and not a single body's been found, or are there any records of children actually disappearing at the institution. The local Indigenous band, though, was given $8 million to investigate the issue, but they didn't really tell anybody what they did with the funds or release any of the conclusions of their alleged investigation. And they found no bodies. The claims of abuse, though, they're escalating as it appears to be like a race between people to recount a historic horror that outdoes prior ones. I mean, one of the enduring and ludicrous claims is that children in Kamloops School were awakened in the night to go out and bury bodies of murdered children as recently as in the 1960s. Now, if this was true, the RCMP should be exhuming these grave sites and trying to find the perpetrators of these crimes. There's no investigation, of course, because it never happened. That didn't stop the CBC, though. The state broadcaster aired the claim of surreptitiously interred children just the other day without questioning it. The mythology isn't just spread through news broadcasts. A Canadian-produced detective series I was watching had a scene depicting an electric chair sitting in the basement of an abandoned residential school. It was explained that the chair was used routinely by priests and nuns to torture students. The electric chair myth is an unfounded story among many that include the other alleged atrocities like hanging babies from hooks and forcing children to work in crematoriums in the basements of residential schools. The stories sound outlandish because they are. These things never happened, yet we have Canadian productions reinforcing the belief they did. Then we have the term genocide. It's been improperly applied in Canada for years. With no actual genocide to be found, activists have broadened the definition of genocide instead, claiming cultural genocide had been committed. It's an abuse of the term, and it's an insult to the races and cultures that experienced real genocide. Canada is an imperfect nation, but it's not a genocidal one. And to state that truth is to invite an onslaught of abuse on social media and bring about the labels, of course, of denier and racist. The NDP is even trying to criminalize disputing allegations of Canadian genocide, and their bill to do it might just pass in the Canadian House of Commons. The cycle of victimhood continues to expand as people self-identify as intergenerational victims of residential schools. I had one young social media influencer. He was applauded on X for his bravery as he announced his grandparents, uncles, and aunts all went to residential schools. Now, while it's not impossible, it's pretty unlikely that his family members were residential school attendees. Only 150,000 children attended those schools over the course of a century. In the last generation, there were very few who actually attended. But if you listen to the claims of some, it appears as if every Indigenous person in Canada over the age of 50 attended a residential school, and nobody ever questions those claims for fear of being labeled intolerant or insensitive. When I questioned the gentleman's assertion, he responded with a tirade of obscenities and blocked me. Typical response to questions rather than presenting evidence. He also identified himself, though, as a residential day school survivor. Well, what was a residential day school? Well, residential day schools were structures built on reserves where children would leave home in the morning, attend classes, then return home. In other words, they were schools. The only difference is the ones in reserves were under federal management. Most of us did indeed survive school, but we don't have to put the label survivor in front of everything we say. Now, with true residential school attendees becoming actually a rare commodity, race hustlers in the legal world turned their attention to regular schools, and it paid off. Children who attended these day schools took part in a massive class action suit, which the government settled rather than fought. 150,000 survivors of these day schools qualify for payouts between $10,000 and $200,000 each. Now, the widespread in compensations based on the alleged suffering due to attending the schools. That's quite an incentive for claimants to make up horrific stories about their time in the school, isn't it? And since nobody dares to question the assertions, the stories get wild and unbelievable. Ironically, there probably would have been a class action suit launched if there weren't day schools either, as children would have lost the opportunity to get an education. The provision of education is entrenched in most treaties, actually, because bands signing on to the treaties demanded it. Yes, indigenous people actually asked for the schools. The residential school system was not a success. I mean, there's no doubt there was some abuse and that the manner of imposing the system caused terrible social damage. That doesn't mean the system was genocidal, though. And we don't have to accept every specious claim of abuse at face value. Canada's Indigenous people are in dire socioeconomic straits, and something must change. But I mean, things are only going to get worse for them no matter how much money is tossed their way. To start with, we're entrenching a culture of victimhood based on falsehoods, and it's not helping matters. It's causing social division and has led to hundreds of churches being burned or vandalized, and it's costing a fortune. We do need reconciliation, and we need to put the old divisions to rest. But we need the truth first, though. And as long as we continue to let mythology dominate the day, healing and reconciliation are never going to come. All right. Happy Truth and Reconciliation Week, guys. I'm sure it'll be a week soon, won't it? Whenever Trudeau needs to win new points somewhere else. All right, let's check in on other news going on out there with our news editor, Dave Naylor. You're in studio today.
In studio today, we got our camera back from Edmonton, all safe and sound. So
you look much better, presented in the light of the studio rather than that laptop in the newsroom.
A friend of mine was talking to me this morning, and he said, you bring up the word chemtrails, and all the people are screaming, show us the proof, show us the proof, show us the proof. But you bring up this residential school hoax, and all of a sudden you're accused of being a Holocaust denier. I mean, there's no
good combination, a good comparison.
Absolutely no proof that has ever been found.
Yeah, right? And I got the squirrels on X all worked up because I called out the chemtrails lunacy.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, well, just makes more money for you, right?
Well, sure. Just keep watching my account, guys, and clicking on it because I am paid by the click. So carry on.
Exactly.
Yes.
Fun, good news day again, as usual. It's crazy this week, Cory. Our top story at the moment is the Alberta UCP conference coming up next month in Red Deer. Will be the biggest political convention ever held in Canada. More than 5,400 delegates are signed up to go. So that's going to be quite the party up in Red Deer. Speaking of partying, the Alberta government said today that they are not going to allow booze sales in corner stores or grocery stores. They think things are going just Jim Dandy now. It's despite the fact their conservative counterparts in Ontario just launched it a couple of weeks ago, and they actually sped it up to get alcohol and booze in corner stores. We got the transportation safety report into a horrible crash west of Calgary last year, where a small plane took off carrying 6 people and crashed into the side of the mountain during foggy or cloudy conditions. And the report says it was mainly pilot error because the pilot shouldn't have been attempting to fly in those conditions and sadly made a terrible mistake. And we've got a mainstream poll out showing the Liberals, believe it or not, are on track to win 0 seats in Ontario. Can you imagine that? 0 seats in the biggest province in the country, including 0 in Toronto. It's just quite unbelievable, Cory, how low Trudeau is going. And we've got our opinion editor, Nigel Hannaford, talking about the situation in Israel, saying he doesn't expect it to become a World War III type scenario, and we'll certainly be keeping our eyes all day on what's going to be happening and when Israel strikes back, because at some point, they're going to in a very forceful way. And our British Columbia reporter Jared Yager is on the scene right now in Vancouver, where a leaders' debate is going on, and he'll have a report on that later on this afternoon, Cory.
Great. Yeah, Jared's really been producing out there in BC, regular stories along with covering that election.
Well, you know what? It's been many a year since we've had an interesting election in BC. So this one is truly going to be exciting. And our Chris Oldcorn in Saskatchewan, they kicked their election off yesterday. So Western Standard is the place for all your Western election coverage.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to that federal election, too, to see if Trudeau can pull off a seat in Ontario.
Please bring it on.
Set the bar low.
Hey, and he's even projected now to lose his own seat in Papineau, Montreal. So wouldn't that be terrible?
Oh, it would be such a shame.
I still can't. I don't understand how he can't see this humiliation coming and stay on.
He's living in a cloistered world. Whatever. Riding the train down gives us lots to go on about anyways.
Yep, exactly.
All right, well, I'll let you back into that newsroom, Dave. I appreciate the check-in and in person. It's much better this way.
Much better.
And we will talk to you after the show.
Thanks, Cory.
All right, thanks. As you could hear, yes, lots of stuff going on, guys, lots of stuff breaking. It's a crazy world out there, and it gives us lots to try and cover and sort through. The reason Dave's so busy in there and so many reporters are expanding into other areas, though, is because you guys have been subscribing. So whilst I see somebody in the commenting scroll so upset that I dared to say I get paid by the click now and then, well, we also get paid by subscribers. That makes us answerable to you, which means, hey, if we put out bad content, you won't subscribe, we'll go out of business. We've been expanding, we've been doing well, and it's because, guys, you've been subscribing, and we really appreciate it. That's why we're independent. That's why we talk about the subjects that legacy media is too chicken to talk about, is because we're accountable to you. $10 a month, $100 for a year. You get past that paywall. It supports our reporters around here. It supports me for these broadcasts and the columns I put out. So if you haven't subscribed yet, get on there, guys. westernstandard.news/subscription and take one out if you haven't yet. And if you already have, thank you very much. So so you see, it's funny to watch the comments scroll. I know some of the people watching this on TV and such who aren't watching it live, you don't get to see some of it, but it's good to see a guy pop out of the woodwork. I mean, they're just like mice or other pests. When you try to talk about the subject, the first thing they do is come out and call racism. It means they have no case. So we have George Nelson popping in there. Doesn't really sound like an indigenous name, but who knows? But he's white knighting is what he's doing on behalf of our First Nations. Saying, oh, wild and unbelievable, just like white folk are saviors. Piss off, George. We're tired of you guys sidelining the narrative, and you're falling to the wayside. People are speaking up. We've had it. We've got to talk about these things, and we're tired of, being told what we can cover and what we can't cover. It's very scary when we have, bills being proposed to actually make it illegal to discuss an issue, and that's what we're looking at from the NDP on this. It's absurd, and when the federal government is in such disarray and so desperate and led by such a clown, it's not impossible to believe that this bill might get through. I don't think that anybody, people like my upcoming guest, would probably be charged under that bill. I'm certain my monologue probably would have gotten me charged under that ridiculous bill. We would get through the courts, because then, I would almost say, fine, charge me, take me to court. And then we can go through the process of discovery. That'll be really interesting, won't it? So then would we perhaps need to take a shovel out in Kamloops and have a look around? Let's just see if there's 215 children down there. There might be. But if that's the case, why the hell haven't we dug them up and gotten on with a forensic investigation to find out what happened? Why haven't we repatriated these children with their families? It's funny, we're turning over the entire Winnipeg landfill to look for a couple of bodies that might be there, because apparently it's sacred to find the remains of these indigenous people and put them to rest with their families. Okay, fair enough. But then when you talk about Kamloops, they say, no, we have to leave those children there. It's sacred ground. What do you mean? They're murder victims, according to you guys. Their story bounces all over the place. Again, we need truth. And when you shut down discourse, you will never find the truth. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay, fine. Let's have the discussion. Let's have it in the open. Don't try to shut me up. Don't call me names. Don't try to make laws to make it illegal for me to even talk about these things. That's not the way to find the truth. That's the way to a dictatorship. That's North Korean stuff, guys, which I guess shouldn't be terribly shocking from people like the New Democratic Party of Alberta. But we've also had an issue in academia, and this has been going on for a long time, and spread around. And certainly a victim of it has been Dr. Frances Widdowson. She's been outspoken, and she's been a fantastic critical voice on this issue. And well, she's still getting canceled as she tries to discuss these issues. So I'm going to bring Ms. Widdowson on, and we'll discuss some of that. So thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Widdowson. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So you took part in the creation of that book, Grave Error, which kind of discussed some of the Kamloops issue and the residential schools hysteria and some of these things. A well-researched book. And like with any book, you would go out, you would promote, you would discuss. But it appears you're getting canceled in your attempts to do so.
That's correct. So, I was canceled at the University of Lethbridge in February 2023. I was able to speak at the University of Alberta in January 2024 on academic freedom under security. Planned quite well, but very expensive. And then I am going to the University of Regina tomorrow. I was supposed to give 2 talks. I've been invited by the president of the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship to give 2 talks there. One on the grave error at Kamloops. Should it be described as a hoax? That's the question. So I'm going to look at the arguments. I was going to look at the arguments that were being put forward in favor of that position and those that are opposed to putting forward that. And myself, I actually don't think hoax is the best word for it personally, but my mind can be changed on it. Anyway, Jeff Cashin, who I know very well, he was the Dean of Arts at MRU, great guy. He's now the president of U of R. And his associates decided I should not be allowed to speak on that subject or on indigenization and academic freedom because it would create an unsafe environment there, which is absolute nonsense. At the University of Alberta, where I spoke, it was all theatrical. People grandstanding, speaking off their phones. This is no danger. So this is just being used as an excuse to censor critical views about all the areas of Indigenous policy that are currently going on. Anyway, I'm going in anyway to the University of Regina. I've got my colleague Lloyd Hawkeye Robertson, an Indigenous psychologist and adjunct professor at U of R, and we are going in there tomorrow at 11 o'clock to do some Spectrum Street epistemology. The claim that we're going to examine is this university protects academic freedom. That's our claim.
Yeah, well, and I mean, just to explain to some folks who might not be as familiar with academic freedom, the concepts of it, the importance of it. I mean, it's been battled over generations, and that's the reason tenure was created. I mean, so that an academic could take up an unpopular position, even an incorrect position, but would be protected to be able to at least examine and discuss and move forward with that. But the protection of tenure, as you unfortunately demonstrated, has been torn away, where they would rather, again, shut people down than have a discourse. That's a very disturbing trend for higher education.
It is. Universities cannot survive without it. And we are seeing serious corrosion of the ability to discuss a number of issues in the university. Indigenization is one of the big ones, but there's a number of other ones as well. Trans activism being the one that comes to mind the most. And people who are not concerned about the state of our universities don't understand the important role that universities play. We need universities because that's where our professionals come from. That's where, and if you're going to have an ideological training ground for those professions, the level of services that you're going to get are going to be inferior. We need to be able to pursue the truth, and we can't do that anymore at the universities. And so what is that going to mean for the level of knowledge in society? And finally, as the Supreme Court has stated in a decision, we need to have freedom to be able to self-actualize as human beings. So universities are one of the bulwarks against the dictatorial developments that are happening in the wider society. And if you knock out the universities and the ability to discuss things there, you are going to have a domino effect in the rest of society. So people are not worried about our universities because there's a few eggheads who are getting canceled. It has much, much wider implications that everyone should be concerned about.
Well, absolutely, and just the social aspects, the broader discussion among student bodies and others, the evolution of this. And again, there's always been battles between the establishment, sort of, and higher educational institutions. A couple of generations ago, it was more the left screaming for the right to speak out against wars, to speak in favor of women's rights and of minority rights. They were getting shut down by the establishment, or at least pressured, and they fought to have those discussions on university grounds. Now it's those people of the same ideology, but it's the next generation, and they're the ones trying to shut out broader discourse. I mean, the danger is the same both ways. We have to protect these institutions so that we can examine even the issues that make us squeamish or controversial.
Exactly, and this phenomenon now is what has been called wokeism, which is the identity politics that has become totalitarian. So people who demand that you must affirm the identities of oppressed groups, and you mentioned in your introduction the residential school. So if you see yourself as a residential school survivor, everyone else must pretend to believe that, because it's argued that somehow this will enable you to empower yourself and to overcome the oppression that your group has experienced. This is not a left-wing position to demand that subjective beliefs, whatever they may be, should be affirmed. In fact, it is going to have terrible consequences for the Indigenous population, because the Indigenous population needs truth more than anyone else needs it. Like, they need to understand why Indigenous people continue to suffer these terrible conditions. And what is happening now is all sorts of falsehoods are being manufactured by the Aboriginal industry, which is a group of lawyers and consultants, largely non-Indigenous, that diverts money, billions upon billions of dollars, away from the much needed services in Indigenous communities: healthcare, education, combating the fetal alcohol syndrome problem, the huge fetal alcohol syndrome problem, the water problems. This is not getting resolved because we're spending money on trying to find non-existent missing children and giving funds to people like Sean Carlton, Keisha Subernant, Negon Sinclair, all these sort of people who are, promoting this false idea that there's all these murders that have taken place and all these missing children. And it creates a lot of anger within the Indigenous population. And they certainly should be angry, but they should be angry at the lawyers who are making billions of dollars off of all these ridiculous types of initiatives that are going on, instead of addressing the actual problems which exist in Indigenous communities.
Well, yeah, and that gets on to something. I mean, when a lawyer or a firm wins a class action, they've hit the jackpot. I mean, those are big ones, because you can be speaking on behalf of thousands, or in this case, 100 and some thousand people, and you take a little shave off of every settlement. And I found it really disturbing when I looked into the day school settlement. So the government, again, they didn't even want to fight this. That's, oh boy, you know what? We'll just cut a big check. We will settle for kids who went to school. 10,000 to 200,000 is the range of the settlement, depending on what the student claimed as abuse. Well, every student is going to claim massive abuse. I mean, I'm sure there's some principled ones who are just going to say, well, boy, I could use $200,000, but you know what? It wasn't so bad. I'm not going to lie to claim that. But unfortunately, some people are going to make stuff up and nobody will question it. I hate to say it, but there's monetary reason to make up myths and atrocities, which again, if people believe those, though, it harms the other Indigenous people thinking that these things really happened. It's an awful cycle we've begun.
Exactly. And it's not even, one doesn't even have to go so far as to say people are intentionally lying about these things. You know, people tend to have confirmation biases where they believe things that are in their interest. Memories are incredibly malleable. And you have people now going around with all these terrible stories. So it doesn't take much for those stories to be absorbed into the psychology of people. And what you're going to find is that when you make these payouts, because you're not addressing the root cause of the problems, you're going to have even more anger that is going to exist within the Indigenous population, because they're going to deep down know that they have been used by this huge industry of people that is making billions of dollars while they continue to live in these terrible conditions, which need to be addressed. And that's what we need to be focusing on, but we're getting diverted because of the understandable sympathy that people feel for the terrible conditions that Indigenous people are experiencing. So it is this terrible cycle that's now been going on, I guess, since the 1970s, when we decided the way to address Indigenous problems was to just divert huge amounts of money to the Indigenous organizations, and they could look after the problems, but they don't look after the problems. They just distribute that money amongst all the privileged members of the Indigenous population, and the underclass is just becoming more and more marginalized, and nothing is being done to address these problems.
So, I mean, kind of on a bright side, we have new tools to at least get out there, discuss with people, and get information out, though we should be able to do it right in these educational institutions. You haven't given up. You're out there. As you said, you're going to be out there later. You were at UFC. I saw your video you posted with your Spectrum Street epistemology. So you're bringing the questions to these institutions, just if you want to let us know what you're getting up to there, and then how people can view that on YouTube.
This is the way forward, I've decided, is because what happens with the universities is they just cancel you in terms of trying to get rooms, because they claim that they're not going to grant you space because this creates an unsafe environment. And I know this is untrue. So I now am getting together some students and free speech groups and so on, and I'm going in to these universities with my portable microphone and speaker and my mats, which are slightly agree, strongly agree. And we go in and we look at claims. And on September 30th, Kathy Drake, a great student from Mount Royal, we both went into the University of Calgary with our video equipment and my speakers and my mats. And we discussed the claim, we must have truth before we can have reconciliation. And then we found out where Kathy said strongly agree, but then this led to all sorts of other claims, such as the remains of 215 children have been found at the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And of course, Kathy was strongly disagree. I would be strongly disagree, but we're hoping to get other people who would be in the strongly agree kind of camp to discuss it. And at the University of Regina tomorrow at 11 o'clock a.m., Lloyd Hawkeye Robertson and I are going in, and we're hoping that there will be other people who will also come, and we can talk about the serious academic freedom problems that exist at the University of Regina. And Jeff Keshen, who I know well, who's a great guy, I'm calling upon you. You are a leader of the University of Regina. Do something about the terrible academic freedom problems at your university. This needs to be resolved in order for us to be able to discuss these serious issues that are plaguing Canadian society. If we can't discuss them in the universities, we will not be able to discuss them anywhere.
Oh, well, I really appreciate that. And as you said, those discussions have to be held. I mean, there was at University of Lethbridge, a professor some years ago, I can't remember his name, it doesn't really matter. He was a full-fledged open communist. I strongly disagree with his ideology. But never for a second did it occur to me that this man should lose his tenure or job over that. It just means we'll get up there and explain why his ideology is sick, then fight with him, debate with him. I mean, fight, I mean figuratively, of course. But, to cancel everything by saying it's unsafe. If you want to ask about who's unsafe these days, ask a Jewish student in a university in Canada how they're feeling. But they don't seem to be in a hurry to protect their safety. I do hope that you don't. I know you're not afraid of that. That's why you're jumping right into it. But I hope you don't draw the attention of any, dangerous people when you go out there.
This has not happened at all. This is not what this is about. What they're saying is unsafe is people disagree. They don't like what you're saying. And I'm a socialist. I'm a follower of George Orwell. I'm not some right-wing, alt-right, whatever kind of epithet you're going to hurl at people. But George Orwell, who was a socialist, was very afraid of the tendencies within some socialist movements to clamp down on people's ability to discuss things freely and all the other freedoms that we have in liberal democratic societies. We want to have those freedoms, but we also want to address the terrible economic circumstances that tend to come along with capitalism as well. But in order to even figure this out, we need to have freedom of expression. Freedom of expression must be the highest value, because if we don't have the ability to discuss things, we will not be able to figure out all the other values. And so if you're a communist, well, that's an ideology. Let's have a discussion. Let's try to figure out whether this is a valid position or not. But we're not going to be able to do that under the current climate, because the truth has already been found. It's just a matter of intimidating people into pretending that they believe this quote unquote truth, which is not truth. It's a whole bunch of falsehoods, which is just people are using intimidation to try to get people to go along with.
Absolutely. Well, before I let you go, some of the folks watching this on TV, your appearance in Regina will have already passed, but for lots of folks who are watching live right now, you're going to be in Regina tomorrow at the university. Yes. And where's your YouTube channel and other social media areas so people can see how it went and perhaps support you or follow you as you go along?
Yeah, so I'm also giving 2 talks, one at the library at 2:00 in Saskatchewan, the Central Branch, and then in the evening at 7:00, Paul Viminetz, Lloyd Hawkeye Robertson, and I are going to be speaking on cancel culture in universities. The best place to find me is on Twitter, Woke Academy. That's the handle, and everything goes through there. I also have a YouTube channel, but I believe it's Francis Widdowson 1600. If you just Google my name on YouTube, you'll be able to find that YouTube channel.
Great. Well, thank you very much for what you're doing and for joining us today, Dr. Widdowson. I hope it goes great in Regina tomorrow and with your further activities there.
Yes. Fight now and fight hard. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So yes, as was said, if you look up Francis Widdowson, you can find the information on social media and what she's up to. It's good to see, because a lot just give up, a lot throw their hands up. I'm certain there's a lot of people in academia who want to have good, long, nuanced discussions on these issues, but they're afraid of it. They're afraid of the pushback. They're afraid of the intimidation. And we've seen that. We've seen that at universities. I've seen things with other, yes, it's usually conservatives who are the victims of it, but, where these lunatics will be outside pushing air horns and banging drums and doing everything they can to stop critical discussion. If you're not on the side of speech, you're wrong. It's as simple as that. You're wrong. If you can't debate the concept of the other person without trying to shut down their ability to even express themselves and speak, you're wrong. You've lost. And in the long run, you will lose. You're not saving anybody. You're not helping anybody by shutting down discourse. When it comes to First Nations policy, and I've written on it a lot, I spent a lot of time, I was 20 years in the oil field before, I moved on to things like this right now. And the question I got to ask people, how's it working out so far? We've had a whole generation of admitting and accepting mistakes were made, of trying to fix damage from past bad policy. But how is it working out? I'll tell you how it's working out. Terribly. Absolutely terribly. The reserve system is a catastrophe. If you haven't been to a reserve, go check one out. Go for a drive. A lot of them have no trespassing signs. You can't even get into them anymore. It used to be kind of more open. You want to get a little piece of the third world within Canada, get onto a northern reserve and have a look around. Look at the dilapidated houses. Look at the visible evidence of substance abuse. Look at the wild dogs. Yeah, they typically have wild dog problems on these reserves. Now, you see, the discussion quickly turns to, you're shooting at natives. No, I'm shooting at the conditions of the reserve. Don't try to shut it down by calling me a racist for criticizing policy. A policy is not a race, but policies can be racist. And you know what's racist policy? The reserve system. It doesn't get any more racist than that. We're taking a race of people and separating them from everybody else. And then we can't seem to understand why the people who are separated from everybody else are in a socioeconomic nightmare. We've been here before, guys, in South Africa. We did that. How did that work out? It did end eventually, but look at the suffering, the division, the lack of progress that it caused, the foolishness of those vain, dominant boors who felt that they could take a portion of the population and stick them off to the side, utilize them when they feel is right or wrong. That didn't help anybody. And the current reserve system isn't helping anybody on or off the reserve. We have to admit it's a bad policy. We have to work towards an end of that policy. There's no simple way to end it. We can't just flick a switch and say, okay, the reserve system's over, you're on your own. No, I understand that. There's been some good writing on how we could start to work towards that, though, within using property rights. Start to think about looking down the road, splitting these reserves up. What are we seeing in the long run? What do you see out of things? A lot of people talk about, too, they say, oh, it's the treaties. Oh, BS. BS. Look, read the treaties, look them up. They're online. They're quite easy to find. And they're actually pretty simple documents. For the most part, they just show the boundaries of what the reserve is supposed to be. That's where there's been a lot of infringements. That's where the government suddenly, discovered, hey, I want that chunk of land. We're sorry we gave it to you, and we're going to infringe on it later. Okay, fine. And we've been working on resolving those things. Most of the other stuff is in the Indian Act. It's not in the treaties. One of the things that was in the treaties, as I said in my monologue, is schools, actually, ironically, that the demand was education had to be provided for the people on the reserves. And then, of course, the government had to find a way to do that, and that's how they set up the residential schools in the first place. But whatever. The bottom line is, we don't have to maintain the reservation system, the reserve system, due to the treaties. This land can be split up. Get rid of the Indian Act. I mean, listen, the name itself stinks. It's an outdated term. Indians are from India. But that's the name of the act. And it's a racist document. It's two-tiered policy. It's policy for people of this race versus people of that race. No country where you have literally entrenched policies for different races, it never ends well. If we want equality, we want reconciliation, we all have to be together. And of course, I see George Nelson, the pinhead who's in my comment scroll. The folks watching on TV aren't seeing it. That's fine. He brought out the A word, assimilation. Oh, blow it out your butt, George. Evolution isn't assimilation. First Nations people, pre-Columbian, were Neolithic nomadic cultures. It's not an insult. It's just the actual technical state of where the development was with the First Nations people at that time. And in a relatively short time, they had to go from that into, as a culture, as people, into look at the modern structures and concepts and politics and ideology that we have today. It's no wonder it takes generations and generations and generations to adapt to that. So yes, there's been dysfunction. But we can't just sit and say that those old ways were better. They weren't. They were primitive. And again, every culture, you go far enough back, there's going to be that. Now, to come out of that old primitive culture, to bring somebody forth from it, isn't assimilation. It's adaptation. It's moving forward. You don't have to lose your cultural practices. You don't have to lose your values. You don't have to lose your language. But you do have to move out of a lot of the old ways. The days of a subsistence diet nomadic world are gone. And guess what? There's that romanticized version too, as if the First Nations were living in some sort of Disneyland paradise before European colonization came about. Guys, they died before the age of 30 on average. It was a horrific, short, I believe there was on description saying brutish life. They were warlike amongst each other. I mean, it wasn't a paradise, folks. And, these modern comforts of today, which they should be able to enjoy like everybody else, and they're moving towards it. But Angela, one of the commenters saying victimhood's being used like a currency, and it is. And when they sink in, oh, woe is me, woe is I, and everybody else, yes, woe is you. How do you ever advance and move forward when you perpetually consider yourself a victim? Yet we entrench that. We constantly go on and on about it. It's not like we want to forget the injustices. No, they happened. And if there's ways to reconcile those injustices, let's do it. But to mire themselves and for the establishment to encourage people to be mired in this, everything and anything that goes wrong in your life is somebody else's fault. Guess what? You're never going to get better in your own life and world. Fantastic people on those reserves. Fantastic people. I worked with them a lot when I was in the field. But the conditions they're in is just a recipe for dysfunction, for misery. And by every measure, it's failing. We can't pretend we aren't spending on it. Look at First Nations spending, federally, provincially, locally, versus, on top and above every other service that First Nations people get as Canadians, which they should. How's it working? Well, lowest life expectancies, highest cancer incidence because of poor lifestyle habits, highest crime rates, highest domestic violence rates, lowest education completion rates. They're failing on every single front. How bad does it have to get before admitting it's a failure? And it still always astounds me. What do these usually, white bread urban liberals think? What do they think when they say we got to preserve these reserves, these isolated northern reserves, the ones that I've been up to, where there's no local resources really? I mean, certainly it seemed like a good chunk to grab 130 years ago when you thought you could live off the land in a cabin and hunt and fish. Those days are gone. So what do you expect? And what do they want? Do they see a nice little zoo there? I've protected some indigenous people up there, and we'll just fund that. And it's a place we can go look at now and then, and perhaps they'll do a dance in their jingle dress for us or something. No, they're misery. They're terrible up there. And it's not doing them any favors at all, no matter how much money's pumped in. What do you expect? They're stuck in the middle of nowhere and told they're victims every day. They're not going to get out of that. I mean, okay, so here we go. Here's one of the beauties too, George saying. George, yeah, because he's such a prime example. He's beautiful. I'm glad he's in the comment scroll today. Boil water advisories. Yes, the water issue. The water issue on First Nation reserves. Why is there never water available, clean water on First Nation reserves? Well, guess what, guys? It's not for lack of funding. Oh, no, it isn't. Multiple governments for decades have been giving them water or money for water supplies. But they blow it. They don't spend it on clean water. Look, I live on an acreage. I get clean water from the ground to a filtration system into my house, and I drink it every day. It's no problem. But I have to maintain it. It takes a degree of personal responsibility. I have to spend the money on that. I have to check on it and then pay somebody to check my system and fix it. That's not happening on the reserves because we've created dependencies where they aren't being responsible. And it's not saying that these people are inherently irresponsible. They've been put into a position of irresponsibility, overrun by bureaucrats. Whereas municipalities everywhere else can manage to deliver clean water and take sewage out, reserves can't despite the funding. And it's because it's a broken system, a corrupted system often, unfortunately. And again, yes, you look at many of the cases that nobody likes to talk about, but look at some of the stuff that's happened up in the Horse Lakes Reserve in Alberta. I won't go on the long strings of things. Check out some of the joys that Chief Snow brought to the Stoney Reserve out in western Alberta. Look, the system isn't working. We've got to have frank discussions. We've got to get realistic on a lot of these things. We've got to start talking about them. When we shout people down, when we don't allow the discourse, when we illegalize discourse, is anything going to get better for the First Nations right now? Because they're crap right now. It's not going well. And then when they come off of the reserve, there's where we got a lot of problems too. I mean, go into any major city, particularly in the West, and look at the unfortunate people who are suffering from addiction, who are homeless, who are on the streets. And yes, it's predominantly First Nations people. It means they're having a heck of a time adapting even when they get off the reserve. So yeah, we want to transition, want to make sure they're doing okay, because obviously something is terribly wrong when they're so overrepresented there. And I get sick of the other discussions too, though, because we see a problem, but we immediately go to the wrong cause. I was listening to the news the other day when they talked about the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in prisons. Yes, they are far more than represents the population. We're talking prison populations of 40, 50% sometimes, even though they only really make up 4 to 10% of a population in a given area. Why? Well, it's because they're committing the crimes. That's why. And I'm not saying every First Nation's a criminal. No, we've got a problem. We've obviously got a problem. But what are the social aspects that are putting them into conditions where they're committing so many of the crimes? But instead, the woke morons say it must be that because there's racist judges. It must be because there's racist police. It must be because there's racist, court systems. No, that's not the case. The case is a failing system that's unfortunately put these people in a position where they're guaranteed to lose. And then they end up in the prisons. Then they end up on fentanyl on the streets. Then they end up overdosing. It's, we've got to address the fact that the system's failing instead of pretending everybody else is at fault, everything else is fault. The other big thing, it showed all the most dangerous cities in Canada. That was a recent study that came out a little while back. And guess where they all are? It's like Prince George, it's Kamloops, it's Edmonton, it's Regina. Why? Why are these smaller cities having such crime surges? Well, the other commonality is they all have high Indigenous populations. That's because Indigenous populations live in the area, they move to the city, they're socially dysfunctional because they were raised on those rotten racial enclaves we call reserves, and they can't adjust to good life once they get out of the bloody reserve. And then you get the associated crime and disorder and things that are happening there as well. Missing and murdered Indigenous woman. I'll close with that one, another one of the myths. It's not a myth that they were overrepresented with missing and murdered Indigenous women. That's true. But once the study was done, once the commission was struck, once all the numbers came through and everybody looked into it, guess what? Because they tried to make it out as if there's some racist conspiracy that was stealing Indigenous women and killing them, and there was a racist conspiracy not to investigate the crimes. Well, it turns out, no, the solve rate for murdered women, Indigenous-wise, is just as high as with non-Indigenous women. And the same with the ones that have gone missing. The ones that are found tend to be as much as anybody else. The problem was, again, social dysfunction. Most of them were killed by spouses and partners. Again, that gets a real problem and get to the root of the problem, find out why they're socially so distressed, instead of trying to blame everything on racism, because there's racism as exists, but that's not what the giant part of the problem is right now, or at least not directly. It's racism in the sense of woke people thinking we can have more than one policy for different races and actually have it work out. That's the real racism. All right, I'm all ranted out, guys. Yes, we covered everything for Truth and Reconciliation Week, I think. Thank you all for tuning in today. Be sure to tune into the pipeline. We'll have a whole bunch more going on out there, guys. Our panel is going to be covering some things. And watch for our reporters. We're covering the BC and Saskatchewan elections. Get on there, westernstandard.news/subscription. Take out a subscription so we can keep up this free speech and examine these issues. And tell your friends to tune in as well. Thank you again. We will see you next week at this time.